Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jeffrey Thorsby, and I'm the Legislative Director here at the National Association of Counties for our Finance, Pension, and Intergovernmental Affairs Policy portfolio. On behalf of NACO and all of our co-hosting partners today, I just want to thank you so much for joining us. Before I hand things over, I just want to frame things up just a little bit and also give you a few quick housekeeping items. So first of all, why we're here. On May 29th of this year, the Offices of Management and Budget, OMB, published a proposed rule that would completely rewrite the uniform guidance found at 2 CFR Part 200. For those less familiar, the uniform guidance governs every federal grant, cooperative agreement, and pass-through award. It touches virtually every state and local government. So this is not a minor technical update that's being proposed. This is the most substantial revision to federal grants administration since 2013. The proposed rule was published as a joint rulemaking by OMB alongside every federal grant-making agency and introduces new substantive policy requirements, modifies how grants can be terminated, integrates grants administration with the Treasury do not pay system, elevates parts of the framework from guidance to binding regulation, and revises cost principles, audit requirements, and pass-through entity responsibilities. The reason we're here today is to make sure that state and local government practitioners, finance officers, attorneys, policy staff have what they need to begin to understand what this proposal means, how it could impact them, and how to understand to engage meaningfully in the public comment period, which the deadline is July 13th. So I just also want to say we're really fortunate to have an exceptional group of partners and speakers with us today. I want to thank our co-host, which is the U.S. Conference of Mayors, the National League of Cities, International City County Management Association, International Municipal Lawyers Association, and the Government Finance Officers Association. This is truly a collaborative effort, and we're grateful for each of them. A couple quick notes on attendance. We had an extraordinarily high number of registrants today, which speaks directly to how much of this topic matters to our communities. Because of the high turnout, anyone who logs into this webinar, the first 1,000 people will be joined directly into the webinar. After that, you'll be redirected to a live stream. Whether you're in the main session or watching through the live stream, you will still have full access to everything happening today, including the ability to engage meaningfully with us. Throughout the webinar, we're going to encourage viewers in both the main session and the live stream to submit your questions and comments using a QR code on the screen. All submissions will be reviewed and used to develop a frequently asked questions that will be made available following this event. So please engage your questions directly because they'll help shape that resource and also help inform our comments. Also, today's webinar is being recorded. The recording will be made available on our website and also through our co-hosting organization's website and sent out. I also do want to just make note, I apologize for an error message that went out to some attendees for today regarding change of time. That was an error and should not have gone out. So please accept our sincere apologies for any confusion. So here's how our time is going to structure today. We're going to go ahead and kick it over to the U.S. Conference of Mayors for some statements, and we'll receive a presentation, and then we'll be followed by the National League of Cities will walk us through the public comment process and some available resources, and then some concluding remarks from the International City and County Management Association. So with that, I'm pleased to turn things over to my colleague over at the U.S. Conference of Mayors, Dave Gutton. Dave, it's all yours.
Jeff, thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who has gotten on this call on an extremely important topic that will dramatically change the way federal assistance is given to cities, state and local governments, nonprofits, and the like. The proposed uniform guidance was released on the eve of the Conference of Mayors annual meeting in Long Beach a couple of weeks ago. I'm pleased to report that the mayors passed a resolution opposing the proposed rule and also if calling for its outright withdrawal. So we have taken a very strong stance against this, and I think it's a result of the dramatic nature of the proposals that we'll hear about today. We are taking them very seriously. Make no mistake, this is the most threatening and harmful proposal regarding federal assistance to cities that we have seen probably over 3 decades or ever. It is that significant in its scope. We need everyone on this call to submit comments in opposition or your thoughts about how to revise the proposal, and to communicate and get on the record the negative effects that this proposed rule will result for your cities, counties, and states. In short, we need to flood the zone to OMB with comments from all of us on this rule. This is not to be taken lightly. Today's speakers will help us and you do just that. And we are pleased today to have two of the best national experts on the rules of federal assistance, Emily Brock of the Government Finance Officers Association and Matt Hansen of Witt O'Brien's. Both have extensive experience in this field, advise and work with the Conference of Mayors and many of the host organizations on this call. So again, thank you for attending. Thank you for taking this seriously. Emily and Matt, the floor is yours, and thank you for participating in our webinar today.
Well, thank you, Dave. And thanks also to Jeff and NACO for hosting this webinar. As Dave mentioned, Emily Brock here. I know that we have many, probably hundreds members of GFOA on this call. The Government Finance Officers Association is inside of your cities, counties, towns, villages, but also in your political subdivisions in your states. And Dave is not kidding when people who are paying attention to this spans the gamut. Anyone who receives federal funds is paying attention to this. And for that reason, GFOA members' interest in this is effervescent. Our membership, GFOA's membership, has been reaching out for comments and trying to better understand where and how this will have impact on them and how they do their jobs and how it impacts their jurisdictions. So the purpose of this section of today's webinar is twofold. Number one, Matt and I are hoping to explain the proposal. We're going to outline the key changes that are inside of the proposal, and we're going to also describe how they are different than what we currently do as stewards of public funds. But the second side of the coin here is that, as Dave mentioned, we are going to encourage your outreach. So throughout this section, we're going to give you questions and ask for your participation in the form of polling. Make sure you have your cell phone handy because there are QR codes. We're going to ask for feedback from you. We will also give you a number of questions that you'll want to ask in your own letters. Ultimately, as Dave said, it's important to have a flood of an impact. We checked the Federal Register this morning to see about 28,000 letters already submitted into the Federal Register. So we would like to join that effort with just as many cities, counties, towns, villages, and political subdivisions. Now, when we ask you specific questions, it's important for you to frame your comments with specific information, because it's important as we walk through each one of these slides that you think to yourself, how do each of these proposed changes change how you receive federal funds in your jurisdiction? Let me say it another way. The most effective comment letters articulate broad principles, but they also are specific. So think about each part of the presentation and think about what kind of impact that's going to have on you and your jurisdiction, and start to outline your letter post haste. So let's get started. A quick primer before we get into the meat of the issue. Now, Jeff called it uniform guidance. He called it uniform grants guidance. I've heard it called a lot of different things. UGG, 2 CFR Part 200. It is a horse of many colors, but it is certainly one thing, and that is ubiquitous for recipients of federal funds. The way that it works is that federal funds flow to recipient agencies by first in the process an appropriation from Congress. Congress passes a law and establishes legislative intent for the money. How should the money be sent out? How should it be spent? and what kind of outcomes is Congress expecting as they are distributing those appropriations. Now, once that money flows out of Congress, the agencies then organize, the granting agencies then start to organize. They say, what are the reporting requirements? How do we collect what we're asking to be reporting requirements? So how do we designate a portal? How do we make sure that we make reporting easier or easily accessible by the recipients of these federal funds? Now, those two are sort of the spokes in the handle of the umbrella, but the actual umbrella of the distribution of federal funds is this Uniform Grants Guidance, and that is the Office of Management and Budget overseeing all of the federal funds distribution across the agencies and within the recipient universe. And they do that by establishing Uniform Grants Guidance. Those Uniform Grants Guidance allows for audits for your agency to report back officially how were the funds spent. So you can see there is definitely a well-instituted process right now as we receive federal funds and spend federal funds and report back on federal funds. So that does lead us to the question, why in the world do we care? We know something big is happening, but why do us as grant recipients actually care about this? There's billions allocated to state and local governments. And again, the distribution of those federal funds is to satisfy the legislative intent. Well, Uniform Grants Guidance provides that audit of the spend of the federal funds. Because this is a process that already exists, it's very likely your agency already has responsive systems of internal controls in place. On these slides, I've just taken 4 of GFOA's best practices on how to have governance systems for grants administration in place. What are those internal controls you should have in your organization for grants? We talk a lot about indirect cost allocation throughout our best practices, and we also dip a toe into the big pond of CEPA preparation, which is also a part of Uniform Grants Guidance. So we try to make sure, as we are recipients of federal funds, to have those systems in place to be responsive. Now, we care because when the system is disrupted, then we have to change our own policies and procedures to be responsive to that. And you'll see as we walk through these slides how that might change our processes and policies in place. Now, last before I turn it over to Matt, I want to just pose for you a rhetorical question. Is this something new? Did this come out of the woodwork and we woke up one morning and we saw it? The answer is no, not really. The White House on August the 7th of last year distributed an executive order addressing oversight of agency grant making. The EO articulated many of the key principles that we're seeing today. Only now it is specific official rulemaking, and it has a stated implementation goal of October 1st of 2026. Yes, you heard me right, implementation in 4 months. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Matt to describe those core principles which the White House hopes to achieve. Matt, take it away.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks to the partner associations for putting on this really important webinar this afternoon. This first slide may be the most important in the entire presentation to fully understand the current federal financial assistance landscape. Historically, grants management focused on 3 things: programmatic performance, financial accountability, and compliance. The proposed rule suggests federal agencies may increasingly focus, and I shouldn't say suggest, it definitely is telling us that federal agencies will increasingly focus on national policy priorities, workforce verification, recipient eligibility, reputational concerns, and real-time monitoring. Grants management is expanding beyond finance and compliance into risk management and governance. In short, a transition from the what is being funded and how it's being managed to the why is the funding actually needed and how it aligns with administrative priorities. This is a really significant shift. On the surface, OMB stated objectives are straightforward: improve accountability, clarify that these are regulations, and reduce burden. The question many recipients are asking, however, is whether the proposed changes actually reduce burden. While there are certainly streamlining provisions, there is some good in here. All organizations will experience increased documentation requirements, monitoring, and reporting expectations. But most importantly, uncertainty about the viability of federal funding streams for critical local projects and priorities will exist going forward. Next slide. So as was mentioned twice or maybe 3 times already, this is real serious stuff. This slide is not intended to be hyperbolic, but I would argue that the proposed rewrite of the Uniform Guidance represents the biggest change to federal grants administration that I've seen during my 32-year career. This includes when the OMB circulars were consolidated into the original Uniform Guidance back in 2014. Many of the judicial victories over the past year and a half have been won on the premise of inconsistencies between administrative actions and the various underlying regulations. Many of these items that are now being proposed in the Uniform Guidance are being added specifically to prevent future legal challenges to administrative actions. There are also a few significant items that were not included in the proposed rewrite, with caps on indirect costs being one of them. There was, however, language included in the pre-award section that says, all else being equal, preferences for discretionary awards should be given to institutions with lower indirect cost rates. This is yet another shot by this administration at indirect cost. And even though there weren't larger revisions in the proposed rewrites, we can fully expect that there will be more attempts by this administration to clamp down on indirect costs going forward. So for simplicity, we've grouped the proposed changes into 4 categories. The first one being sort of overarching administrative changes, the next section being pre-award requirements, then post-award, and finally some impacts on the audit environment. We'll walk through each area and discuss not only what's changing, but what questions recipients should be asking today. There are many great summaries of the proposed rewrites already available, including by many of the associations who have sponsored this call. So we're not going to go and try and get into everything. If you want to have a conversation about the prohibition on conferences and professional membership, we can have that conversation. There will certainly be time for more discussions around educating ourselves about everything that's in it and how we need to implement it. But today it's really an attempt to focus on the high level, the top line items, and what your organization should be thinking through right now while the public comment period is still open. So we're going to start with the administrative section. So the first administrative change is that uniform guidance becomes regulation. This is a foundational change. Historically, agencies had to separately adopt certain uniform guidance updates. Under the proposal, uniform guidance changes would automatically apply government-wide. That means less variation between agencies, but also less flexibility. For recipients, this could result in faster implementation of future changes and fewer opportunities for agency-specific interpretation. This means that the proposed implementation date of October 1st is a very real milestone to be preparing for. We have heard from agency sources that they are already working on implementation plans, including rewrites of their own agency grants, policies, and procedures. So the federal agencies are moving ahead, full steam ahead, preparing for implementation on October 1st. Why this is so such a historic change is agencies like Health and Human Services historically did not automatically adopt the uniform guidance. They actually operated under their own rules for several years. Going forward, that's not going to be an option with not only these rewrites, but future rewrites. Next slide. So the next administrative change has to do with termination language. Obviously, when this administration started, there was lots of attempts to terminate grants. Some of them were successful, many were challenged legally. This proposal significantly expands agency authority to terminate awards. Traditionally, termination was tied to non-compliance or performance issue. The proposed language introduces broader concepts like agency priorities and the national interest. The challenge for recipients is understanding how these terms will be defined and whether priorities could shift during a multi-year award. The term discretionary does not mean limited to just discretionary grants. It means the discretionary authority of the federal government. So I just want to point that out. Questions you should be asking yourself right now, and be asking the administration through the public comment period. How will priorities be measured? Can priority change mid-award? How should recipients manage the risk, etc.? This is pretty significant language and one of the most impactful parts of the rewrite. Finally, this slide reflects the increasing integration of executive branch priorities into grants administration. I think we've all seen over the last year and a half that whether it be OMB memos, executive orders, you name it, this administration has been trying to integrate their executive branch priorities into all things federal financial assistance. The proposal formalizes senior level review of awards and incorporates several policy areas directly into the grant review process. Regardless of anyone's political views, recipients should recognize that grants administration, will certainly increasingly intersect with broader policy objectives. Every single notice of funding opportunity being issued through grants.gov right now is being reviewed at OMB through a political lens. That's a significant change. Every notice of award, every funding decision memo that's being processed at any federal agency is being reviewed through political appointees. And that's only going to increase with the proposed regs here. Additionally, the proposed rewrite calls for the incorporation of presidential executive orders and uniform guidance. I don't want to get into the severity of these executive orders. They've been talked about at great length. There's litigation that's occurred. What is quite damaging here is about the executive orders actually being incorporated into regulation. And how do you undo this, administration to administration? So on this slide, we have our first QR code. We'd like your feedback. Let us know your top concerns or potential opportunities of the proposed administrative changes, conversion to regulation, discretionary termination, and or senior level appointee. How will your approach to federal grants change as a result? And Emily, I don't know if you want to add anything about the specific feedback you're looking for.
Yeah, and Matt, thank you for that. I would strongly recommend folks to just go ahead and pull this QR code up on your phone. These are significant letters and responses that our national organizations are creating on your behalf. And so for you to contribute your thoughts, your specific thoughts, it helps us to craft a larger, more fulsome letter. As I said, there are 29,000 letters already in there, and GFOA, NLC, NACO, IC, we're all going to be part of that. We would love it for you to be a part of that. The purpose of this will help you kind of stimulate a thought on response. But Matt, you hit the nail on the head in that from an administrative perspective, this is an overhaul from the federal perspective, right? So the flow through of information into the federal government is going to substantively change. And so what I'm going to turn to now, again, fair warning, I'm about to change slides, so make sure you get out your phone and take a picture, get a shot of this, menti.com, please, and give us your thoughts. Because I'm going to shift over into the pre-award requirements. But I want to define what we mean by pre-award requirements. So pre-award means that maybe you're pursuing a federal award, but it has not yet been awarded. And so, this process has historically been understanding those NOFOs. Now, it used to be my favorite acronym, NOFOs. NOFOs are actually notices of funding opportunities, and they're a fundamental part of the federal government getting the word out to say there are these opportunities for you, assess whether or not your entity can not only receive the funds, but can deliver on the contractual obligation to make sure that you are doing, you are establishing and making sure you're carrying out that legislative intent. Now, government finance officers have long supported streamlining and using plain language to make sure you enhance the number of potential applicants for competitive grants. We're big fans of trying to make sure everybody's got an equal shot. And also, we know because of that, it's kind of a joke as I'm going across the country doing grants administration training. Plenty of public entities have struggled to navigate a fragmented framework with different terms, different timelines, different submission expectations. And so because of that, you tend to have a fragmented approach to pursuing grants in your organization. You may not have a central grants administration inside of your own organization. So the proposed changes to NOFO process takes a little bit closer to information access for entities, that is us as recipients. It helps drive us closer to that assistance that we have long asked for. So, I think GFOA's comment and generally, making streamlining efforts, making accessible plain language requirements, helping us understand that, you have a 30-day lead time. All of those things actually are pretty good for us. And so commenters may want to acknowledge how proposed change, any tiny proposed change in here that improves or streamlines the grant application process might actually be a welcome change. And certainly dive into that, think about those changes to NOFOs, and if it does help your entity, make sure to leave a comment on that. Now, on the other hand, there are other pre-award requirements that may have a different tact in your organization. That is, there's substantial real estate in this proposal dedicated to the notion of a pre-award risk review. And as we're reading more and more about the specifics of the pre-award risk review, we're a little concerned that while a pre-screening stage could potentially lower the upfront burden on applicants by allowing to submit maybe a shorter or preliminary concept before investing a ton of resources in a full proposal, we think that this might be a bit of a challenge for communities with limited administrative capacity. It also creates a bit of an additional gatekeeping step. And more importantly, if evaluation criteria are not clearly defined, we worry that applicants might have little transparency into why they were or were not selected to submit a full application. If you go into the proposal, there is a brief description of the merit review process. If you can actually find it, the NOFO template found in Appendix Roman numeral 1, but we're left with little detail about the evaluation criteria. What we do know from the proposal is that evaluations will include references to questionable practices, memberships, affiliations, and other publicly accessible information. So understanding what that is would be useful for an applicant. What do these terms mean? Can we see a list? And how will the factors be weighted are very important parts, I think, of a risk review for us as we're thinking about applying for grants. Now, we also mentioned on this slide as a part of a pre-award risk review process, there is a requirement in this proposal for states to utilize do not pay and for everyone to e-verify. Now, while do not pay is an existing process and e-verify is an existing process, what is new about this is that it's a requirement through regulation. So additional pre-award review requirements combined with potential administrative conditions like conferring payee eligibility on do not pay for states and e-verify for all of the recipients may increase the administrative cost of participation before the funds are even awarded. And I can't emphasize that enough. What we are really concerned about is the more administrative requirements you throw on the front end of even a pre-award discussion, that elongates the administrative challenge, I think, for applicants. And it ends up being something that added burden might alter the cost benefit analysis, especially of smaller entities, maybe pursuing smaller grants. That cost benefit analysis changes whether seeking federal support remains worthwhile. So those are some considerations that you all may want to think about as you're drafting your letters for submission. Now, as the pre-award framework is set up agency by agency, it's also natural for pass-through entities to ask very important questions. And I know that there are many pass-through agencies that are participating on this webinar right now. So those pass-through entities, you know, a rhetorical risk question is how do you monitor reputational risk? But those pass-through entities that are on this call, and I know there are many of you, your requirement for pre-awards will also be an assessment of actions damaging recipient reputation, agency reputation, and federal government reputation. Again, not well defined in this proposal, so it certainly might be worth in your submission to ask, what does it mean to have actions damaging recipient reputation, and how is it monitored and weighted? Now, we have right now on this slide, if you haven't seen already, click back to the screen, we've got our second QR code. And what we are asking in this second question is, how will this change, this pre-award requirements change to NOFOs and pre-award risk reviews, change your organization's approach to federal grants? And if you could, in your comments, be as specific as possible, that would help for us to gather more information as we're working with the administration and considering our own comments throughout this process. Okay, last call before I change slides. Make sure you get a snapshot of this QR code. And what I'd like to do is dive into, I think, the wheelhouse for GFOA members. That is grant administration at the local level. So this is the phase that is post-award. This is maybe you've been awarded the grant, and this is where your internal controls kick in. This is where your grants administration kicks in. This is where these are common practices that are written into your internal controls and your processes and your procedures. And the proposal changes how they are going to operate. So the first key change when it comes to grants administration is, you know, the notion of subrecipients. So having subrecipients isn't new. Requirements for monitoring subrecipient spend is also not new. In fact, GFOA has a few best practices on how best to do that. But this proposal would change that. A fundamental change that this proposal requires is a formal designation of all downstream entities as either a sub-award or a contract. Now, what we are concerned about is that any misclassification could trigger SAM.gov reporting deficiencies and could potentially form a basis for termination, those discretionary terminations that Matt outlined a few slides ago. There's also a new provision that requires pass-through entities to ensure subrecipients do not, and I quote, significantly damage the reputation of the pass-through entity, funding agency, or of the U.S. government. However, our concern remains the proposal fails to specify an example of the reputational change. So federal agencies are going to have to monitor those pass-through entities' compliance with sub-award monitoring and management tasks and also pass-through entities and federal awarding agencies are going to have to take corrective action as necessary, thereby increasing enforcement risk. So, you know, us as an organization, GFOA members, are seeking clarification on a number of items in here, including, well, how should transfers between government departments be treated, or those intergovernmental transfers? What about definitions? Can you help us define reputational harm? And then also, of course, questions about corrections. Is there a way to correct SAM.gov reporting? So those types of things may be of interest to you as you're crafting your own comments. Two more in grants administration. The proposal rule requires payment justifications submitted by recipients to federal agencies and by subrecipients to the pass-through entities to receive the federal payments. So the proposed rule mentions specifically that these written justifications should be brief, but it also mentions that they have to include information on all activities of the federal award that corresponds to the payment request. So those types of things could include project milestones, project activities, administrative activities, and other requirements that must be completed under the award. Now, the way that we think about it at GFOA, we've got 35,000 members who have millions and billions of dollars of federal grants. Given the nature of projects funded by federal grants and the federal grant compliance structure, there is a world where these written justifications could become lengthy. And then you multiply that across hundreds and thousands of awards, subawards, contracts across the grant landscape. What we're concerned about, in addition, is administrative burden could become significant, but potentially more important, it could slow down the distribution process. We are very concerned about timelines for completion, for start, for the entire grant's life cycle for a recipient. So there are some good questions that recipients should ask. So, you know, will there be limits to length and contents of justification? We also ask, should OMB consider a phased-in approach? Maybe larger justifications come in first to all the way down to the nitty-gritty details. And then last but not least, will recipients be expected to implement before the federal agencies? So we are thinking through these new documentation layers strategically, and we would encourage you do as well. Now, our third QR code is up on the screen if you want to click back in. We are very interested in getting your feedback on the grants administration section, but I want to go through one more grants administration change proposed in this rule. And that is added cost principles. Now, of most concern to government finance officers is the new cost restriction related to the general cost of government, including costs related to and I'm quoting here, general activities of the executive, legislative, or judicial branches of government. And it includes costs related to, and I quote here again, general activities related to public safety, public information, citizenship, enrollment, or taxation that are not related to a specific federal award. To us, those two quotes taken in context really are ubiquitous of what everything a government does. So, you know, we are concerned because state and local governments pursue and accept federal funds to implement programs that are authorized by law to carry out. It could potentially mean any federal grant award carried out by a state and local government could be considered related to the general costs of government. And so some clarification is in order. How clear will the delineation between grant activities and general government activities be? And additionally, how will OMB or federal agencies provide further guidance specific to grant programs? We are hyper concerned, again, about clarification of terms that are used throughout the grant administration process. Now, if you've had a chance to click on the QR code by now, encourage you one more time, maybe pull up the slides, take a click. This question really is for, like I said, the wheelhouse of your finance teams. Tell us how these changes in the administrative functions of grants monitoring will change due to this proposal, specifically that subrecipient monitoring, payment justifications, and new cost restrictions. And please, we're asking you to be as specific as possible. And now I will turn it over to Matt for the audit and update frequency.
Thanks, Emily. Emily covered the real meat of the proposed changes and how they will impact the grants management lifecycle and impact it fundamentally. I've been fortunate enough to support several of the World Cup host committees on DHS FEMA money that they're receiving right now for public safety. And those programs are some of the first programs that are operating under the umbrella of the White House Task Force on Waste, Fraud, and Abuse. And we are already starting to see many of the items that Emily just outlined, whether that be written justifications of payment requests, whether that be pre-screening of subrecipients, vendors, even subcontractors. Those things are starting to happen now by the administration, even in advance of the proposed rewrite. As far as the audit section goes, while there's no major changes to single audit requirements in the proposal, the audit environment certainly continues to evolve. One area is to watch is the compliance supplements. For those that you are not aware of what the compliance supplement is, it's the handbook that auditors use when reviewing programs and conducting their single audits. For those that are responsible for putting internal controls environments in place, they often refer to the compliance supplement to help make sure they have those guardrails set up correctly. Less frequent updates may create uncertainty about current audit expectations, especially during periods of significant regulatory change, which obviously we're in, and new program creation. So just think back to the recent COVID funding, the ARPA funding. That program was being built, as it was being deployed, and there was really nothing for the first several years for the auditor community or folks responsible for internal controls to refer back to. It wasn't until a compliance supplement addendum was finally issued that we had some guidance going forward. So this certainly could be impactful going forward. So how can local governments respond? So obviously the partner associations sponsoring this webinar are encouraging, submitting letters to the Federal Register. They're encouraging advocacy activities, and all these are critically important. But there are also actions you should be taking, looking internally right now as well. The good news is that many of these recommended actions are things organizations should already be doing. The bad news is most are not. So I'll just walk through them real quickly. Monitor all grants in your organization. Many counties and cities are very siloed. Grants exist in individual departments. There is not a centralized view of what your entire federal financial portfolio looks like. So that's really step one. Get everything in one place. Make sure you have a complete inventory of where your exposure might be. The next one is review your grant terms and conditions. Know what you've agreed to already. Some of these, executive orders have already shown up in NOFOs, have already shown up in special conditions. In some of the most recent Department of Homeland Security grants, there is new language about staff Americans stay in America. That wasn't an executive order. That was, just put into as a NOFO language. So really understand, what your current terms and conditions are. Understand internal policies and standards. It's great that, GFOA and other, AGA and other associations have put out really helpful internal policies and standards for you all to adopt. The biggest problem is adherence to them. And that's what we see time and time again, that communities have really strong, documented policies and procedures, but there's not a lot of adherence to them, or there's arbitrary and capricious decision-making within those policy frameworks. So that's an area you really need to clamp down on now, even in advance of the October 1st implementation deadline. Inventory subrecipient relationships, especially during the COVID funding. A lot of first-time subrecipients were created as money was tried to be distributed to, small businesses and associations and people that are typically not recipients of federal funding, either directly or as a subrecipient. So make sure you understand the subrecipient relationships you have, where there might be capacity deficits, and where you might need to rethink some of those relationships going forward. Assess your E-Verify readiness. It's not going to be enough to just check the box and say we as an organization use E-Verify. There's going to have to be a documentation standard that goes along with it. Review payment verification process. Who's pushing that button? Who's making that request for drawdown? Do they have authority? Do they have the supporting documentation? Are they going to be able to provide the justification needed going forward? Enhance monitoring frequency and detail. For a lot of organizations, unfortunately, enhancing monitoring frequency is to go from 0 to something. Monitoring is critical. Whether that's a 10% sample or a 20% sample, you got to get out there. You got to do monitoring. You got to be, that's a key compliance and oversight responsibility, as well as the detail. Monitoring doesn't happen unless it's written down. There are a lot of people that go out and they get tours and they take photos and they never come back and actually document that monitoring activity. So take a look at your existing monitoring files and get an assessment of what it looks like or doesn't look like. Improve your documentation standards, obviously goes without saying. Grants administration cannot live in email correspondence. It's got to be pulled out of email correspondence and memorialized somewhere so that you have the documentation required. And then, just generally speaking, evaluate the exposure across your grant portfolio. There are going to be funding opportunities you probably don't want to participate with going forward because of exposure. There are some that are critically important that you have no option. There are probably grant programs that are in better shape than others within your organization. So really evaluate that and evaluate your exposure, not only now, but going forward. So in addition to the uniform guidance rewrite, certainly there's been changes to OMB Circular A123. There's proposed changes to SAM.gov. There's exposure everywhere, and really visibility and understanding your grant portfolio is step one. Organizations with strong governance and internal controls will be far better positioned regardless of what ultimately happens with the rulemaking. This should really be treated as a watershed moment for grants management. And finally, the management of grants must have the same rigor and hygiene that other functions within your organizations do. The hygiene and rigor that your HR has, that your procurement, that your accounting has, that same rigor needs to be applied to grants management. So what does October mean? It means a lot, maybe, or a little, depending. This is really the question everyone is asking. Will the changes apply only to new awards awarded after October 1st? Existing awards, renewals, continuation? The reality is that we don't know all the answers. Some of these changes are very program specific, and others are more organization specific. Are you going to gradually implement do not pay? Well, probably not. You're not going to do it for one grant and not your entire grant portfolio. Are you going to gradually implement E-Verify? Probably not. So these are some of the things we still need to figure out and get some answers to. But right now, organizations should spend less time debating the applicability and more time assessing exposure. If these provisions are finalized, agencies will eventually need to implement them. And as I mentioned before, we are already seeing and hearing that individual departments and agencies are already working on their implementation guidance. So they're moving forward. So you all need to be moving forward as well to keep up with them. And with that, I'll hand it back to Emily to talk about some next steps.
We hear you loud and clear, Matt, that now is the time to start thinking about this, and now is the time to start planning. And so we'd like to leave you with a clear Easter eggs that you should be leaving in your letter. So as you're doing your outreach, certainly October 1st is a key item that you might want to put in there. But let's give you a couple other questions that you might be able to sprinkle in. Again, as I said, the most effective comment letters articulate the broad principles, but also are specific. So number one, what does your organization do well? What has your organization done well in the past? Explain to them the policies and procedures and the guardrails that you have in place already as recipients of federal funds. Number two, and this is where we're going to ask for specificity in your comments and your communication to this administration. Ask specific questions about impacts to your current grants. And then what that requires you to do is what Matt said on the last slide. Create a repository or a clearinghouse of your organization's outstanding grants. And we would encourage you to ask direct questions about impact. And those direct questions could be direct fiscal questions, direct human services questions, direct credit implication questions about those outstanding grants. And also, there are a few places where they do have exclusions or safe harbors built into this proposal. Ask if your current grants are excluded or if they're part of a safe harbor. And then last but not least, another thing to put in your letter, be specific about timelines. They're specific about October 1st. You should also be specific about the impact of your budget because, oh, by the way, and we love to put these in our letters to the administration, state and local governments have to balance their budgets. So that is certainly a major concern for you, and you should be as specific as you can about that. And last but not least, make sure that you are articulate about how this change will impact your organization's future grants plans, whether it's competitive or otherwise. So just a few things that you may want to consider sticking in there. Now, last but not least, and I would encourage folks outside of the slide deck to come back in. We do have one final question for you. If you could just leave this up as you're thinking about it throughout the day. Did your organization notice a part of the proposal that we didn't cover here today? Tell us specifically what that is and your perspectives on the proposal. So I will leave that up for a minute, and I'm going to turn it over to my friend Dante Moreno with the National League of Cities.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks, Matt, for that really comprehensive overview for what is a very complicated and overwhelming set of proposed changes. As Emily mentioned, my name is Dante Moreno. I'm the Legislative Manager for Finance Administration and Intergovernmental Relations at the National League of Cities. I'd like to re-emphasize how important these comment letters are going to be. Comments are due July 13th, so just under a month away. NLC will be providing a comment letter template in the coming days, as will many other associations that are on this call. But I'd urge you all to go beyond the templates provided and share very specifically about how these changes are going to impact your community, both positively and negatively. The more concrete and local your letter is, the more useful it's going to be. While you're putting your comments together, I'd also encourage you to reach out to your members of Congress, and I would not wait until after you've submitted your comments. I would do so today, tomorrow. Congress can play a very important role in what gets implemented and how, but only if members hear from you directly. Senators are already beginning to raise their concerns, but they're dealing with a lot right now. And your stories and the specific impacts these changes could have on your community are often what moves a member to act. I've dropped NLC's overview blog in the chat. It breaks down our initial concerns about the proposed changes in detail, but as Emily mentioned, and we have this QR code up, it's very large, and we want to make sure that we're not missing something very important to your community. As Matt mentioned, and as we've seen from the comments and questions coming in, there's still a lot of vagueness and uncertainty around OMB's intent and how some of these provisions would work in practice, such as if the changes are going to be applied retroactively and how this will be applied to formula grants. That ambiguity and vagueness itself is worth raising in your comment letters and in your conversations with your members of Congress. I've also shared a link to a survey where we're collecting stories on how grant terminations have already impacted communities, whether those grants were eventually reinstated reinstated or very quickly reinstated or terminated altogether. If you feel comfortable sharing your experience, please do. You can also choose not to be named in the survey. These stories will help all of us on this call make the case for why terminating grants mid-award has real consequences for services, for budgets, and for our community's ability to plan for its future. I know that all of us will be putting out additional resources over the coming weeks. I'd encourage you to stay engaged with NLC, with your own associations as these become available, and ask questions, get involved, tell us what resources might be missing, because again, this is a very complicated and complex proposal. And please don't hesitate to reach out directly with questions. I know that our emails will be on the next slide. I will hand it over to you, Amber.
Thanks, Dante. I'm happy to close it out. So I just want to thank you all for being here today on behalf of ISUMA and our partners GFOA, the National League of Cities, National Association of Counties, U.S. Conference of Mayors, and the International Municipal Lawyers Association. We hope that this briefing gave you a clearer sense of what's in the proposed rewrite of 2 CFR Part 200 and why it matters for your community. Given that federal grants to state and local governments touch nearly every area of local service delivery, we know this is a rule worth understanding well and worth weighing in on. And that's really the most important thing that we want to leave you with. I think I'm the final speaker, but every speaker has told you this. Please submit public comments. Your on-the-ground experience administering these funds is exactly the input that OMB needs as it finalizes the rule. You have our contact information here on the screen. Please feel free to reach out to any of us if you need assistance or you want sort of advice as you put together your comments. So please don't hesitate to reach out. A recording of today's session will be sent out to everyone who participated, and it'll also be posted on each of our organization's websites. We will also share the slides that were shared during the presentation. And as we noted, we're compiling the questions that were submitted both in the Q&A and in the QR code, and we'll be posting a series of FAQs. So again, we just want to thank you for joining us.